Hello everyone and welcome to today's History Sandwiched In. The Historical Society is excited to have you all with us this afternoon. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, a few quick pieces of information. This program, History Sandwiched In, runs from March through November, and it highlights a range of topics relevant to the history of the people, places, and spaces and events of Wisconsin, as well as the broader Midwest. For those of you that have joined us before, welcome back to a new presentation. It is our pleasure today to introduce Dana Kelly, who is presenting From Fjords to Fields, the Norwegian American Legacy in Wisconsin. The opinions expressed today during the presentation are those of the speaker, and not necessarily those of the Wisconsin Historical Society or the Society's employees. Before we hand it over, it is an absolute privilege to introduce today's lecturer. Dana Kelly is the Executive Director of the Norwegian American Genealogical Center here in Madison. She earned her degree in Scandinavian Studies from UW-Madison and lives on a dairy farm just east of Madison with her husband and 3 children. Thank you all again for being here, and please do enjoy the presentation.
Thank you very much for having me today. Like she said, my name is Dana Kelly, and I have been a member of the Norwegian American community here in Wisconsin my entire life. And I was born in Madison. I was raised just east of here in what was once the largest Norwegian American settlement, the Kashkonong Prairie. And I attended UW-Madison, like she said, got a degree in Scandinavian Studies. Incidentally, they are celebrating 150 years this year, so it's a big deal for the Scandinavian Studies Department. I've also served on the board of directors for the Kashkonong Prairie Historical Society since 2009. And in 2019, I joined the staff of the Norwegian American Genealogical Center. So I'm what I like to call a professional Norwegian. So you may hear a little bit of bias about how great the Norwegians in Wisconsin are, because this subject is so close to my heart. So Norwegian Americans really don't make up a large percentage of Wisconsin's population. According to the 2020 census, we make up about 6% of the population here in Wisconsin. So when people are thinking about where Norwegians settled, Minnesota usually gets all of the love. And it is true, there are more people with Norwegian ancestry living in Minnesota than there are in Wisconsin. But Norwegians came to Wisconsin before they came to Minnesota. And this map actually comes from our historical society. It's based on data from the 1905 Wisconsin State Census. So each township is colored according to the primary ethnic group found in that township. Blue is German. Green means that there's a real mixture in that township, so it's kind of hard to pull out one particular dominant ethnic group. But yellow is Norwegian. There are a lot of Norwegian townships in the state of Wisconsin, at least there were in 1905. So first things first, there would be no legacy for Norwegian Americans here in Wisconsin if everything in Norway had been perfect. So I took both of these pictures, actually. Now, can you tell which one is Norway and which one is Wisconsin? They are definitely not the same. People often look at this image on the left and they say, oh, why would anyone leave someplace that is so stunningly beautiful and come to this flat prairie with a few trees here and there? Well, one of these places has a really good farmland and the other one doesn't. Only about 3% of Norway's land can actually be farmed, and by contrast, 30% of Wisconsin can be used for agriculture. And that was the primary driver out of Norway and into Wisconsin. People wanted farmland. Norwegians wanted to continue that same agricultural lifestyle that they had in Norway when they got here. Now, yes, some immigrants left for other reasons, and definitely Norwegians pursued other careers other than farming. But for the most part, they came here because they wanted to farm, and Wisconsin created that opportunity. And they definitely did it. Based on the data from the 1930 US Census, of all of the ethnic immigrant groups to the United States, Norwegians were more likely to be engaged in agriculture than any other ethnic immigrant group to the United States. Norwegians were more likely to be farming than other groups were. And Jenny mentioned that I have a farm. I am one of those stereotypical Norwegians who has remained in agriculture longer than the average person. And actually, I have a side note about that. This morning, I'm all dressed for work. I've got this dress on, and I'm filling up my water bottle, looking out my kitchen window. We've got a calf loose. So my kids aren't there. I texted my husband down in the barn, but he was milking. So I think I got all the calf slobber off this dress after getting her caught and put away before I got here today. So I'm going to back up just a couple of years before Norwegians actually got to Wisconsin. 2025 is a really big year in the Norwegian American community. We are commemorating 200 years of organized Norwegian immigration to the United States. In 1825, a group of 52 Quakers from the Stavanger area of Norway bought a sloop. It was named the Restoration, and they left Norway in July of 1825, and they landed in New York that October. So their story deserves a lot more attention than I can give it today. We don't have all day, but suffice it to say, this was the first organized group of Norwegian immigrants to the United States, and they formed the first Norwegian American community here in the United States. And they blazed a trail for hundreds of thousands of immigrants following behind them for the next 100 years. After spending a winter in upstate New York, the sloopers weren't very happy with the conditions they found themselves in. They thought the land was too expensive. They thought the winter was too harsh. Now think about that. Norwegians thought the winter was too harsh in New York. So they sent a scout, his name was Clang Pearson, west. And Clang Pearson walked all the way from upstate New York to just outside of present-day Chicago. And he found land there, and he said, this is it. This is where the Norwegians need to be. So he walked back to New York, and he told the group, I found it. And most of that colony from upstate New York followed him to Illinois. It's now called, appropriately, Norway, Illinois. So if you're looking on the map, that's where it is. And they established the very first, Norway, Illinois, LaSalle County. So it's just outside Chicago. They established the very first permanent Norwegian settlement here in North America. So during the 1830s, Norwegians started venturing north into Wisconsin. And this man, Ole Nattestad, was the very first documented Norwegian to visit Wisconsin. In 1838, he came to scout land for the folks who were living in those Illinois settlements. He and his brother Amundsen were very influential in encouraging immigration from Norway to the United States. And this man here, he was the very first Norwegian actually to claim land in Wisconsin. He had 180 acres right on the Wisconsin-Illinois border. His farm was in Clinton Township, actually, just south of Janesville. So the very first Norwegian settlements here in Wisconsin were on that border, on the Rock and Jefferson Prairies in Rock County, just south of Janesville. But Muskego is the settlement that usually gets the most attention when we talk about Norwegian immigration to Wisconsin. The legend about this, the first group of people here, was that they were coming from Norway in 1839. Their plan was to go to Chicago. And as they were coming through the Great Lakes, the ship made its customary stop in Milwaukee. And supposedly a man got on the ship with two other men. One of them was fat and one was skinny. And he told the immigrants, he said, this fat man lives in Wisconsin. This skinny man lives in Illinois. Where do you want to stay? And he allegedly convinced them that they should get off the ship in Milwaukee and stay in Wisconsin. So most of the good farmland was already taken in the Milwaukee area by 1839. So the immigrants wound up just a little bit south in what is now the Muskego area. Now, Muskego is a pretty low-lying, kind of swampy area. And in 1839, though, they were having a drought. So the Norwegians didn't know that where they were settling really wasn't great for farming. And of course, the next year, the rain came and the climate returned to what was more typical. They were dealing with malaria and cholera and a lot of issues. So eventually the settlement moved a little bit further south to some drier, higher land that was better suited for agriculture. Now in 1840, one of Wisconsin's notable Norwegian immigrant families arrived, and that's the family of Hans Christian Heg. They settled in Muskego, and Heg was definitely not a household name until just a few years ago, in spite of the fact that his statue stood outside of the Wisconsin Capitol building for nearly 100 years. Most people didn't know who he was. He was a politician. He was head of the corrections system in Wisconsin, actually, when the Civil War started. And he decided to recruit Norwegian immigrants to serve in the Civil War. And Colonel Heg led the Wisconsin 15th, and he was killed in battle fighting for the Union. And his unit, his regiment, was almost exclusively Norwegians and the children of Norwegian immigrants. They pretty much all spoke Norwegian. Now, during 2020, his statue was vandalized. I'm sure you all remember that, and it was reinstalled a couple of years later. So the picture on the right is one that I took the day that it was rededicated. It was kind of a dreary day, but there were a lot of Norwegian Americans who turned out to celebrate Colonel Hans Christian Heg. The Heg family was pretty influential for Norwegian immigrants in those early years. Colonel Heg's father, Evan Heg was his name. He was very prominent in the Muskego settlement. His barn is where they held all the church services in Muskego. His barn was kind of like a hotel. It's where all the newcomers came when they first arrived in Milwaukee and were looking for a place to get their bearings before they launched out to the settlements farther west. Norwegian immigrants were very literate, generally speaking. Norway had a state church, so Lutheranism was very important. Confirmation was a really important rite of passage for young people in Norway. And in order to get confirmed, you had to be able to read the Bible, you had to be able to read Luther's small catechism. And so as a result, the Norwegian immigrants were generally quite literate, and there was a very active Norwegian language press here in Wisconsin. One of the very first Norwegian language newspapers was published in Muskego. It was called Nordlyset, which means Northern Lights. And the Heg family was also very instrumental in getting this newspaper off the ground. One of the reasons they thought press was so important was this is how the Norwegians could know about current events. This is how they could learn how to become US citizens, learning about that process and learning about what was going on in the United States. So I mentioned that Muskego had its share of problems as a settlement. It was pretty low-lying and wasn't really very well suited for farming, but it was pretty conveniently located near Milwaukee, so it did make a good launching point for a lot of immigrants. But the immigrants wanted to farm, and Muskego wasn't such a great place for that. So a lot of them didn't remain in the Muskego area for long. In 1839, a few men from some of the Illinois settlements came into Wisconsin looking for cheaper farmland, and they found some of the best farmland in North America. And I am not exaggerating. If you drive just east of Madison and take a look at our fields, you will not find an irrigation system anywhere in this gray shaded area. It is outstanding farmland, this area. This was the America that the Norwegian immigrants had been hearing about. This is what they were looking for. This settlement was called Kaskenang, and it became incredibly famous in Norway. You can look at old letters, and they are addressed to Knut Larsen, Kaskenang Prairie, North America. And they got here. Everyone knew this place. So Kashkenang was not the first Norwegian settlement by any stretch of the imagination, but it didn't take long for the population to overtake these older settlements in Illinois and Muskego. And Kashkenang continued to grow. By 1850, 2/3 of the total Norwegian immigrant population lived here in Wisconsin, and 40% of them were in Kashkenang. It was a huge settlement. So Kashkenang is actually home to the very first Norwegian Lutheran church in North America. And people always look at me and say, Dana, you are splitting hairs. You bet I am. Yes, there were church services being held in the Norwegian language in the Illinois settlements, in Muskego, but none of the men conducting those services had been ordained by the Norwegian Lutheran Church. They were either lay preachers or they'd been ordained in some other tradition. But there was a wealthy businessman in Norway who paid for this man here, Reverend Johannes Wilhelm Christian Dietrichson, paid for his passage to Wisconsin because he was genuinely concerned about the souls of the pioneers out there in the wilds of Wisconsin. So Dietrichson arrived in Muskego in August of 1844, and he got to Muskego and they said, great to see you, but you know who really needs you? Those folks over in Kashkenang. So Dietrichson walked from Muskego to Kashkenang, and he started 2 churches. On October 10th, 1844, he formally organized the immigrant families on the eastern side of the Kashkenang settlement and formed the East Kashkenang congregation. 3 days later, he did the same thing on the western side of the settlement, and he formed West Kashkenang Church. So I would argue that East Kashkenang Lutheran Church is the oldest Norwegian Lutheran congregation in North America. So right after Dietrichson got these congregations started, the parishioners got started building some churches. They were logs. This is a model that somebody had created for the Kashkenang Prairie Historical Society. And West Kashkenang was dedicated first on December 19th, 1844, and East was dedicated a few weeks later in January of 1845 for East Kashkenang. And these buildings were pretty much identical. They were about 28 feet by 36 feet, and they were pretty sparse. They had some wooden benches and a pretty plain old altar in there. But the West Kashkenang Church building was the very first Norwegian Lutheran church building in North America. The other Norwegian settlements didn't have dedicated churches. They were worshiping outside, they were worshiping in homes, they were worshiping in people's barns. West Kashkenang had the very first building that was established just to be a church. And these log churches obviously are long gone, but East Kashkenang still has some logs from that original church. So if you would like to see some logs from 1844, 1845, they're on display in their church if you pay them a visit. There is one other historic church in Kashkenang that you can visit. As the Kashkenang settlement grew, the East and West Kashkenang congregations felt that a church was needed in the northern part of the settlement. In Deerfield Township, they built the Liberty Prairie Church in 1851, and this church is built of limestone. It's not a log church. So you can see what a contrast it is to the log churches that were built 6 years earlier. There's only a 6-year difference between this building and the log church. And this was never meant to be a temporary home the way that the log churches were. This was meant to be forever. So in 2026, St. Paul's Liberty Lutheran Church, that's what it's called now, will be celebrating its 175th anniversary. And this building is the oldest standing Norwegian Lutheran church building in North America that has been continuously used as a house of worship by its congregation since it was built. It's never been moved from its original site. They dug the basement with the building sitting right there. And you can go see it. It's still sitting there. If you're driving on 12 and 18 from Madison toward Cambridge, it'll be off to your left, just past the round barn. You can't miss it. It still looks just like this. Now, not every Norwegian immigrant was devoted to the Norwegian Lutheran State Church. There was a movement that was particularly popular in Western Norway that was started by Hans Nielsen Hauge. And he believed that anyone who could read the Bible can and should lead religious gatherings. So these so-called Haugians started Lutheran churches here in Wisconsin too, not just illegal churches in Norway. They started legal ones here. So many of the Haugian churches have eventually joined other, as the synods merged, like the Missouri Synod and the Norwegian Synod, eventually they all became ELCA, and that happens to most of these Haugian churches. But the oldest intact Norwegian log church is here in Dane County. It's over by Mount Horeb. The Hauge Log Church is there, preserved. It's in a park. There's a nonprofit organization who takes care of it. You can go visit it. It is still sitting there. Do you remember Little Norway? There was a folk museum near Mount Horeb for many, many years that closed just a few years ago that was dedicated to celebrating Norwegian heritage. And this building was the centerpiece. It came from the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago originally. And Little Norway was owned by the Daly family. Dalyville is named after them. They're a Norwegian family from over by Mount Horeb. Side note about the Dalys, Marie Daly was the very first woman of Norwegian descent to graduate from UW-Madison. But that's not what Little Norway is about. When Little Norway closed, this building, the Norway building it was called, was sent to Norway and reopened there as a museum in Orkanger, Norway. So that's actually where I took this picture. When I was visiting Norway, I took a picture of this while I was there. And it was kind of like standing in Mount Horeb again, but I was in Norway. So when we're talking about the Norwegian legacy in Wisconsin, there are definitely some things you can't skip over. And one of those is the impact of Norwegians on agriculture here. Norwegians engaged in all of the forms of farming that you can do in Wisconsin. I'm not going to pretend that there aren't Norwegians who had orchards or hog operations, but the one crop that is particularly associated with Norwegian Americans is tobacco. And I have a map here from 1919 that shows US tobacco production. And I zoomed in on Wisconsin. It's not high res, but you can see which parts of Wisconsin were growing tobacco back in 1919. And when we put that side by side with our ethnicity map, we can see that the tobacco production is concentrated where the Norwegians were living. And this is not a coincidence. This is uniquely Norwegian American, and it's really unique to Wisconsin. We don't see this same trend in Iowa or Minnesota or North Dakota. It is pretty much just here. Tobacco historically, and still is for sure, primarily grown in the South, but you can grow tobacco here. I took these pictures just outside my house over the weekend. This is tobacco being grown in Wisconsin right now. And the reason it is here is because during the Civil War, the North got cut off from its tobacco supply. So they started growing tobacco here in the North so they could get a hold of their chewing tobacco and their smoking tobacco. And if you have ever worked in tobacco, you know that this is a hands-on, labor-intensive, monotonous, hot, dirty, just awful job. And who gets hired to do monotonous, unpleasant, manual labor jobs? Well, oftentimes it's the new immigrants. And during the Civil War, who were the new immigrants in Wisconsin? Well, it was the Norwegians. So Norwegians did not come to Wisconsin with tobacco growing skills. This is something they learned when they got here. But they realized it was a really good cash crop. And so they kept growing it even after the Civil War was over. I just absolutely love this picture. It's from a journal article that was called Norwegians and Tobacco in Western Wisconsin, written by Carl B. Rates and Cotton Mather, and it was published in 1971. And what I love about this picture is you can see the Welcome to Westby sign is in Norwegian, and in the background is a tobacco shed. So why did Norwegians continue to stick with this crop? Why did they outlast the Germans and the other Yankee farmers? Well, Norwegians were very supportive of agricultural co-ops. They were very supportive of that movement. And during the Depression, when the Germans and the Yankee farmers and the Irish farmers got out of tobacco because the prices were unpredictable, the weather was unpredictable, Norwegians supported each other with pricing information and market information and tips for growing under different conditions, different varieties you could grow for different conditions. They were able to weather that storm and continue this tradition. So even if farms still aren't supporting a tobacco crop, you will often see this lasting shadow of Wisconsin's tobacco history. These are all tobacco sheds that I took pictures of over the weekend just driving around the block where I live. And they're scattered all over Wisconsin though. And most of them have been repurposed. Most people are using them as machine sheds and for storage and other things. But you can tell that they are tobacco sheds because you can see that about every third board is on hinges and can be opened to allow airflow for the tobacco crop that's hanging in there as it's curing and drying. Now, 3 of them are old, but you'll see in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a fairly new tobacco shed there. This is my next door neighbors. The Lund family still raises a lot of tobacco, and they built a more state-of-the-art tobacco shed to accommodate their crop. And you can see they have a barn quilt on the end of their barn with tobacco leaves on it, to honor that tobacco heritage for their family. Now, it wasn't just tobacco where Norwegian Americans made their mark in Wisconsin industry. Lumbering was another place that Norwegians really spent a lot of their time during the 1800s. Now, unlike tobacco, lumbering was something they came knowing how to do. They were familiar with that. They had the skills already when they got here. Norwegian immigrants were in the lumber camps. They were working in sawmills. They were riding the logs down the Mississippi River. They were doing all of that. It was a great winter job for them. When they weren't farming, they could go to the lumber camps in the winter. And this gentleman on the left here is actually my husband's great-grandfather. His name is Albert J. Anderson, and he was a lumberjack. And I don't know why he took a picture in his lumberjack outfit like this, with his heavy woolen coat and his turtleneck sweater on. But I think it's fantastic. Otherwise, how would we know what he looked like in the lumber camp if he hadn't done that? Valdemar Auger actually took a notice of the Norwegians in the lumber industry. He was a Norwegian immigrant who ran a newspaper in Eau Claire. For decades, he ran a newspaper there, and he also wrote some novels. Sons of the Old Country is one of the novels that he wrote, and it's historical fiction, takes place in the 1850s, 1860s, and it's about Norwegians in the Wisconsin lumber camps and Norwegians in the Civil War. Auger was a pretty interesting character, actually, in Norwegian American history. They have turned his house in Eau Claire into a museum, so if you'd like to go visit that, you can learn more about him. He was also pretty politically active. He was a staunch prohibitionist. And actually, a lot of Norwegians were. There were a lot of Norwegian Americans who were very, very opposed to alcohol consumption. And in fact, the Volstead Act, which basically was what made alcohol illegal in the United States, was named after a Norwegian American from Minnesota. So we don't have to claim him. But it was very popular. The prohibition movement was very popular with Norwegian Americans in Wisconsin. And in fact, Auger's newspaper basically was a mouthpiece for the prohibition movement. His readership wanted to read that. Norwegian immigrants brought something else with them too that became quite a novelty when they first got here, and that's skis. A lot of Americans had never seen skis until they saw a Norwegian immigrant. So the Snowflake Ski Club is located near Westby. It is one of the final 2 all-volunteer-run large hill ski jumping clubs in North America. And each winter they have a ski tournament. It attracts thousands of people to Westby, and the competitors come from the United States, Canada, they come from Europe to compete here. You will never catch me on this. You can go up to 50 miles an hour on that ski run. There's no way I'm doing it. But it was a pretty popular pastime among the early Norwegian immigrants, and it still is today. Skis weren't just for recreation for Norwegians. Snowshoe Thompson he was born in Norway. His name in Norway was Jon Torsteinsen Rue. But his family first immigrated to Illinois. Then they went to Missouri. In 1846, Thompson and his brother came to Mount Horeb. Thompson himself was a kind of a wanderer, so he didn't stay in the Mount Horeb area very long, but his brother did, and they still have descendants in the Mount Horeb area, this family does. Eventually, Snowshoe Thompson found himself living at the foot of the Sierra Nevada mountains out west. And his name suggests that he wore snowshoes, but he didn't. He wore skis. He made the skis himself, and he delivered mail on skis between California and Nevada for 20 years. He carried the mail over the mountains for 20 years, and he was never paid by the US Postal Service for doing that. He did it for 20 years and was never paid. Now, if you've heard of him, perhaps you heard his name in a Johnny Horton song that was recorded in 1956 about his life delivering the mail over the mountains on skis. Perhaps not surprising, Norwegian immigrants were pretty prevalent in the shipping industry on the Great Lakes, especially from Manitowoc. Working on the Great Lakes was pretty appealing to Norwegian immigrants because they didn't have to spend as much time away from home working in the shipping industry on the Great Lakes. If they were in Norway, it was a lot of international ocean shipping, but on the Great Lakes, it was just the Great Lakes. So it was a pretty appealing career choice for Norwegians, and they were recruited by a lot of the Great Lakes shipping companies to come here and work for them. Norwegians were naturals on the water, you could say, and Ole Evinrude was no exception. He was born in Norway, and he immigrated to Cambridge, Wisconsin with his family as a small child. And there's a couple stories about him. I don't know if they're all true, but allegedly when he was a child, he built a boat. And when his dad found it, supposedly his dad busted it up with an axe and told him, "Farming is your future. There is no future in boats." Maybe for anybody but Ole Evinrude. The story goes that he was inspired to invent the outboard motor because he rowed across a lake to get his girlfriend some ice cream. And by the time he got back to her, the ice cream had melted. And he said, "There's gotta be a better way." The Evinrude motor was born out of a need for frozen ice cream for Ole Evinrude's girlfriend. So if you have a passion, though, for his motors, the Kashkonong Prairie Historical Society has a wonderful collection of these, and it's housed in the Cambridge Historic School Museum over in Cambridge. They have a really good collection of Evinrude and Elto motors. So Norwegian Americans definitely found their way into every corner of Wisconsin life eventually, but there are a handful of notable Wisconsinites who have Norwegian heritage who really did make a mark. And one family is the Train family of La Crosse. It's hard to stop a train. You've probably heard that slogan. You've heard of their products. They made furnaces and air conditioners and all sorts of stuff like that. And I've always wondered why when I would see those trucks, I would look at it and think, I really just want to say Tronna when I see that word. Why does it look Norwegian to me? Well, it turns out I'm right. Jöns Tronna was known as James Train after he immigrated to Wisconsin. He came in the 1860s and he started a plumbing business. And then he later invented many things related to heating and cooling for homes and industrial uses. And his son, Reuben, attended UW-Madison, where he got an engineering degree, and he joined his father in business in La Crosse. The company's been in existence since 1913. It's gone through a lot of changes in the last 100 years. It's changed ownership. I believe now it's held by an Irish company, but it is a multi-billion-dollar company now. And This business got its start with the ingenuity of a couple of Norwegian Americans from Wisconsin. So John A. Johnson was another manufacturer here in Wisconsin. He was born as Jons Anders Skibnes in Norway, and he immigrated with his family as a child as well. They farmed east of Stoughton for a while, and then he founded a machining factory in Madison, Gisholt Machine Company. It was named after a farm that he spent a lot of summers on as a child in Norway. It's actually pronounced Gisholt in Norwegian, but we call it Gisholt here. And Gisholt employed hundreds of Norwegian immigrants here in Madison on East Wash. And it was affectionately or not affectionately known as the Norwegian sweatshop. But he provided an entire community to Norwegian immigrants. He provided housing, they had a library, they had a theater in Gisholt Machine Company. It was absolutely amazing. And Johnson was also a philanthropist. He never attended college, and he wanted other Norwegian American young people to have that opportunity. So he started a fund, and it's actually still held by the Madison Community Foundation today. And it was originally established for Norwegian and Norwegian American grandchildren of immigrants to go to college. Now, this is a name I wish more people knew, Clermont Egtvedt. He was born outside Stoughton to a Norwegian immigrant father and a mother who had Norwegian immigrant parents. He became an engineer, and it turned out that he was a really talented airplane designer. So he found himself working for Boeing, and he began climbing the ranks there. And during the 1930s, he convinced Bill Boeing that the company could pull itself out of the Depression if it would just invest more in larger aircraft. And he managed to get them to do it. And so Egtvedt is now known as the father of the B-17 bomber. The B-17 dropped more bombs than any other aircraft during World War II. And that's a pretty cool legacy, that a Norwegian American from Wisconsin had a massive hand in the outcome of World War II. So it's starting to sound like Norwegians maybe only invented and manufactured, but that is not true. Here's a man whose name you maybe have never heard, but his ideas you've definitely heard. Thorsten Veblen was born near Valdres, Wisconsin, to a Norwegian American family, and he grew up to be an economist and a sociologist and a really huge critic of capitalism. You may have heard some of the terms that he coined. He coined the expression leisure class and conspicuous consumption, and those terms became just part of our vocabulary here in the United States. And we owe all these ideas to a small-town Norwegian American from Wisconsin. Now, this is a little more recent in history. Tom Loftus was born in Stoughton, and he was raised in Sun Prairie. And he was the longest serving Democratic speaker for the Wisconsin Assembly before he was named ambassador to Norway during the Clinton administration. He released his memoirs last year. It's a really good read. If you haven't had a chance to read it, I encourage you to grab a copy, or he's out kind of on a speaking circuit too. If you get the chance to hear him talk about the book even, it's really entertaining to hear some of his stories about his time living in Europe in the 90s. Now, this is a gentleman my generation probably knows pretty well, but maybe not a lot of people know he's Norwegian American. Butch Vig is a celebrated producer and musician. He produced Nirvana's best-selling album. He produced for Smashing Pumpkins. He was a founding member of the band Garbage. And he is very influential in the rock music scene for sure. And he's originally from Viroqua, Wisconsin. Legacies come in all forms, and horrifying legacies are still legacies. And I'm including this just so you don't think I'm totally biased and think all Norwegian Americans are fine, upstanding humans. We do have one black sheep who is only a quarter Norwegian on his mother's side. For the sports fans here in the audience, we have a NASCAR legend from Rockdale, Wisconsin, which is near Cambridge. He happens to be descended from some of the very first immigrants to Wisconsin. His family has been here since the 1840s, a very long time. Matt Kenseth was the final winner of the Winston Cup in 2003 before they changed sponsors. Two-time Daytona 500 champion, pretty well known in the NASCAR world for sure. And Norwegian Americans from Wisconsin have also represented the U.S. on the Olympic team. Tim Mickelson from Deerfield won a silver medal in the 1972 Olympics on the rowing team. Andy Ryan from Stoughton won a silver medal in the 1984 Olympics for wrestling. And Ryan actually, he went on to be inducted into the National Wrestling Hall of Fame a few years ago. And he was on the coaching staff of UW-Madison for a while. And in 1992, he was named Big Ten Coach of the Year. Speaking of Olympians, Mark Johnson was born in Minnesota, but I think we can claim him. He scored 2 goals against the Russians during the 1980 Olympics, and he was part of that hockey team that went on to win the gold medal. He was part of the Miracle on Ice. And of course, he went on to play professionally, but he came back to Madison and he coaches the women's hockey team. He's been here since 2002, and they've had many, many good seasons under him. Conrad Elvium, born in McFarland, Wisconsin. In 1937, he identified vitamin B3, previously unknown until Conrad Elvium found it. I know nothing about biochemistry, but allegedly this is the distillation column he used back in his lab in the 1930s. He eventually became the president of UW-Madison in 1958, and his name was on the art museum on campus up until just a few years ago when the Chazins gave $20 million and they renamed it the Chazin. But we still remember him, brilliant scientist and UW faculty member. Believe it or not, I almost forgot this guy. Gaylord Nelson was born in Clear Lake, Wisconsin, to a Norwegian American family, and here we probably remember him most as a politician. He was elected to the Senate back in 1948, and then he served as governor of Wisconsin from 62 to 81, so quite a while. And as a politician, he's remembered for his activism to regulate the pharmaceutical industry. His so-called Nelson pill hearings resulted in side effect disclosures being put in with birth control pills, something that had never been done until he insisted on that. But I think probably the rest of the world remembers him best as the man who founded Earth Day back in 1970. And he has since been inducted in the Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame. Now, we can't really talk about influential Norwegian Americans if we don't mention this man, Rasmus B. Anderson. He was born in Wisconsin in 1846, so pretty early, before we were a state. He was an instructor at Albion Academy, which was the first co-ed institution of higher learning here in Wisconsin. And then he went on to found the Scandinavian Studies Department at UW-Madison. He was a translator, he was a writer. Of all the books he wrote, my absolute favorite is called America, Not Discovered by Columbus. Because he insisted that Vikings were in North America before Christopher Columbus got here, he is often credited with establishing Leif Erikson Day, which incidentally is on October 9th every year, usually just a few days before Columbus Day. Anderson was also a businessman. He was a diplomat. He served as the ambassador to Denmark, actually, during the Grover Cleveland administration. There are 16 schools in Wisconsin who have the Vikings as their mascot. Obviously, I didn't put all 16 of them on this slide because they pretty much all look the same, but it's a pretty popular mascot here. DeForest also is known as the Norskies rather than a Viking. Whitehall is known as the Norse. Westby, they're the Norsemen. So even after all of these years, these Norwegian American communities are still appreciating this legacy, this history in their communities by using a mascot that's so overtly Scandinavian. There are a number of Scandinavian festivals here in Wisconsin still that are held nearly every year. I'm sure I'm missing a bunch. Some of these are pan-Scandinavian, so they include Danes and Swedes in them as well. But some of them are exclusively Norwegian, like the 17. Mai celebrations in Stoughton and Westby. Those are just to celebrate Norwegian heritage. Have you been to a lutefisk dinner? You've probably heard of them, even if you've never been to one. They're often held as fundraisers for Lutheran churches or Sons of Norway lodges. They're usually in the fall, so be watching for them. They'll be announcing them soon. The Sons of Norway Lodge in Stoughton, actually, if you want to get on their email list, they have a lutefisk dinner announcement calendar that goes out so you can track all of the different ones and make sure you hit them all so you don't miss any. This is actually these pictures are from a couple of years ago. It's me and two of my kids at the lutefisk dinner at the Lutheran Church in DeForest. This year it's on November 8th, so mark your calendars. They will serve over 1,000 people. Last year, I think they did 1,300 dinners that Saturday. So they will sell out. Get your tickets as soon as possible. You might miss it. You may miss the lutefisk. And if you're wondering, did my kids like it? My son probably ate 3 pounds of lutefisk. It was absolutely insane. He absolutely loves it. My daughter, whose name is Lena, not so much. But my son adored it. So I took this picture here during 17. Mai in Stoughton one year. 10,000 people descend on Stoughton that weekend to celebrate Norwegian heritage. The event is full of Norwegian American organizations who are gathering to celebrate their heritage. So I made a list of all the ones I could think of, the different clubs and museums and cultural centers here in Wisconsin that are specifically dedicated to Norwegian heritage. I probably missed some, but I know I could list more if I was listing some other groups from Iowa and Minnesota and North Dakota. And if I listed all the ones that no longer exist, it would be one heck of a list. So we're a very proud group, we Norwegian Americans, and we have quite a legacy here in Wisconsin and throughout the country, really, not just here. And we all show our pride in different ways, and I don't really know if I could have come up with a more Norwegian Wisconsin image than this one. If you're driving around rural Dane County and you see a barn quilt on the end of a barn with a Norwegian flag on it, that's where I live. So these are my cows, and this is our barn. If you would like to learn more about the Norwegian American Genealogical Center, our website is here, our email address is here. We'd love to hear from you. We can help you discover more about your Norwegian ancestry. We offer Norwegian language classes, genealogy classes, translation services. We'd love to see you if there's anything we can help you with. So thank you very much for having me today.